the Frankfurt School and their idea of critical theory sounds like it's just kind of a mishmash of different
Yep,
things that, might not be coherent altogether.
that's right. Yeah, I say not even coherent in the sense that I mean, you read these texts; they are dense, jargon-filled, hundreds of pages to say what I would argue could be summarized in 10 pages as an argument. And it's part of a proprietary mechanism here to, you have to buy into the terminology and the language and the method of discourse in order to be a part of the Frankfurt School or be a part of this critical theory approach to understanding philosophy. And again, it's back to that point. If you buy into it, you also accept the ideological priors. And if you dispute those ideological priors, then they'll say, well, you're not a true theorist. You're not a true critical theorist. You don't understand what we're doing.
Right.
So it's a real wishy-washy epistemic trick that they play using rhetorical tactics rather than reason. And this becomes kind of a hallmark of the Frankfurt School, although it's still a fairly obscure
Hmm.
entity. So in the Nazi era, they are a distinct minority of German academia, and they are targeted. We see that also in the citation work I've done. If you look at German citations of Karl Marx, they take off in 1917, and they continue to rise in the 1920s, and then 1933 they drop back down in Germany, but not the rest of the world. Why? Because Marx had been added to the banned book lists by the Nazi government. But part of that also is that the German academic left flees Germany.
Right.
They spread out to other institutions, and a lot of the Frankfurt School theorists they basically pick up and they escape to the United States. Some of them also were persecuted for other reasons. There were several Jewish members of it, but there's also communists in general were banned and targeted by the German government. So they flee Germany just as other academics that are outside of the Nazi philosophical system do. So on the free market side, Ludwig von Mises is in kind of the same
Mm.
boat. He's a Jewish Austrian economist that espouses free market theory and pretty radical free market theory, and he's on the target list by the Nazis when they take over Austria. He basically escapes, just narrowly escapes as they are coming to arrest him, and makes his way into Switzerland at first and sets up refuge at a university in Switzerland, research institute there, and then moves to the United States at the tail end of the war. But the Frankfurt School theorists also follow the same pattern, and a lot of them end up in New York City at Columbia University, where they kind of reconstitute after the war. And the thing you notice in their citation patterns is they're very, very slim in what's supposedly the high watermark of the 1920s Frankfurt School nexus in Germany. And they continue to piddle along at very, very low levels until after World War II. I guess the first that really kind of burst into the scene was Eric Fromm. Some of his psychoanalysis work, which comes out of a Frankfurt School tradition, starts to pick up. Uh, at the tail end of World War II in particular, but the first major Frankfurt School theorist that kind of burst into the academic mainstream is Herbert Marcuse, who's one of that original generation with Horkheimer and Adorno, and Marcuse are the kind of considered the founding figures of that era. And he relocates to the United States and becomes kind of like this guru of the New Left philosophical tradition, the New Left philosophical world in academia, in American academia, in the early 1960s or so. And that's basically where you start to see a salient emergence of critical theory as a prominent school of academic thought. It's really the 1960s United
So
States.
that's where it starts to move, I guess, if I understand correctly, from being kind of almost like a clique into being like a clique that's expanding. It's like kind of this exclusive club, and then it gets kind of more popular, and then it starts to bleed into the mainstream of academia. Is that correct? Okay.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, Marcuse is a major figure in that era. He also articulates philosophical doctrines that are expressly hostile to what he sees as the manifestations of power disparity out of traditional theory. So he argues that basically uh, critical theorists are justified in applying intolerance to certain ideas that he deems to uphold the power structures of society, because part of the emancipatory mission is to tear them
Right.
down. So therefore, it's perfectly fine to exclude them from the discourse, exclude them from the range of what are permissible opinions in free speech. So he takes that in a very illiberal direction in a fairly notorious essay he writes in the mid 1960s on this subject. But he also has generations of graduate students that are involved in a variety of different directions of radical academic activism. So one of his most famous students, dissertation students, is Angela Davis of the Black Power movement. And she has, I mean, she's a Marxist theorist in her own right, and she takes that in a bit of a different direction, but it spends most of the 1970s basically running away from the police because she's implicated in some criminal revolutionary activity. Ends up fleeing to like East Germany and does the tour of the Soviet world and
Wow. Goes home.
says really horrendous things about some of the worst, most brutal, murderous regimes of the 20th century before she comes back to U.S. academia. But it's really the 1960s. You can see this in Marcuse's citation counts, and then the other crit theory thinkers that are operating in his circle. Of that first generation of the Frankfurt School. Their citations start to take off in the 1960s.
Hmm.
So you see them entering into the academic mainstream. By then, there's another generation of critical theorists, multiple other generations. There's also a reconstituted Frankfurt School in Frankfurt, so the next generation of critical theorists comes up there, and they're again similar characteristics. They all tend to be Marxists, but Marxists in a direction that isn't explicitly economic. They're philosophical Marxists.
Right.
They often have schisms between them. Jürgen Habermas is probably the most prominent figure of that second generation, and he kind of comes of age in the 1960s to the present day as the next iteration of the original Frankfurt School critical theory tradition. Although by then there's been hivings out in all sorts of different directions of applying this critical theory methodology, again with the inherited just default assumption that Marxian economics are right, and applying it all over the place. So you start getting outcroppings of critical theory that are applied to very specific areas or segments of society.
And so,
This is critical.
yes,
This
social
is yeah.
justice, feminism too, I believe. There's a bunch of different things. But if we compare that, critical theory with traditional theory, is traditional theory basically just kind of classical theory, like what you would think about in terms of like Enlightenment way of looking at things, the Western tradition of, scientific inquiry and reason? Like, is that
Yeah. Yeah. It's what is rooted in the Enlightenment, at least the most recent iteration of it, before critical theory comes in and tries to seek its upheaval. But it's also something traditional theory goes all the way back to the ancient world. And there are interpretations of traditional theory that these are, they're philosophical inquiries that position themselves. The claim is that they position themselves as seekers of truth, of objective observers of the world, trying to discern the world. And the critical theorist says, well, we need to interrogate that because they aren't really objective observers. They're just providing rationalizations to prop up power disparities that we don't like. And our purpose of interrogating them is to emancipate the world from these power disparities that have been entrenched into philosophy, into culture, into anthropological assessment, sociological assessment, you name it, across the world. And then even by the late 1960s, so there's a whole movement that emerges in education schools. It's called critical pedagogy.
hmm,
And it's a derivative outcropping of critical theory. There's some overlap in some of the theorists where they train, but it's seen as an outgrowth. So it's a new school unto itself, a version of critical theory applied to education in the classroom. And it basically juxtaposes traditional education as like the recitation of facts, the recitation of methods and figures, what most people think of when they view K through 12 education. They said, well, a critical pedagogy is something that tries to instill a form of activism in the students, to
yeah, we
overturn
see that
and
now.
overthrow
We see that
power
all over
structures.
public
Yeah,
schools now, right? So,
it is. And some of the critical pedagogy texts, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed is like one of the most assigned
Wow.
books in education schools, and this is a Marxist crit theory adaptation of pedagogy that's put forth as like a manual of what a teacher is supposed to be doing in the classroom, and what are they supposed to be doing? Overthrow neoliberalism, overthrow capitalism, overthrow all these horrible things that are used as like the boogeymen from the crit theory perspective, because they're upholding power structures of the haves against the have-nots.